In the fall of 2020, a family of 3 moved into an old 2-story house in a quiet suburb of Ohio. The home had been built in the late 1950s and was known throughout the neighborhood as the deal of a lifetime. It had sold for far below its actual value after sitting vacant for a long time before the family purchased it. The couple, Mark and Linda, along with their only son, 11-year-old Tyler, paid little attention to that detail. They were simply looking for a fresh start after years of renting, and the house seemed perfect to them. Spacious rooms, a peaceful backyard, and a large attic beneath the sloped roof that could serve as extra storage for the belongings they hadn't found room for yet. During the first week, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The occasional sounds coming from above were easily explained as the old wooden beams expanding and contracting with changes in temperature, something completely normal for a house of that age. But by the second week, Linda began noticing a pattern that felt very different from the random creaks of aging wood. The noises came at nearly the same time every night, shortly after midnight. They sounded like slow, deliberate footsteps, one after another, as if someone were carefully walking across the attic floor directly overhead, trying not to wake anyone sleeping below. At first, Mark assumed it was probably a squirrel or another small animal that had found its way into the attic through an old ventilation opening. One morning, he climbed up to inspect the space himself. It looked exactly as he expected. Layers of old dust, a few cardboard boxes left behind by the previous owners, and exposed wooden beams coated in grime in every corner. He found no visible opening large enough for an animal to enter, nor any droppings or signs that a living creature had been there. He reassured Linda that the noises were most likely strange echoes caused by the shape of the sloped roof, explaining that old houses often produced misleading sounds like that. The explanation seemed reasonable for a few days, until Tyler started complaining that he could hear something dragging slowly across the ceiling directly above his bedroom, which sat beneath one section of the attic. It sounded as if someone were crawling while pulling something fairly heavy behind them. One night, the boy woke up terrified and told his parents he had heard deep breathing coming from directly above his bed. It was slow and steady, like someone sleeping, or someone trying to breathe as quietly as possible to avoid being heard. Mark and Linda didn't fully believe him at first, but just to be safe, they moved his bed to the opposite side of the room, away from that particular section of the ceiling. As the weeks passed, other small details began piling up without anyone realizing how they all fit together. Linda occasionally noticed small amounts of food missing from the kitchen, and assumed someone else in the family had eaten them without mentioning it. She also found that some of the old items stored in the attic seemed to change position every so often. A box moved from one corner to another, or a cover shifted slightly out of place. She blamed it on mice, even though she never found a single dropping to support that theory. The upstairs temperature also behaved strangely. Some nights, she could feel an unexplained warmth drifting through the attic vent, as though a faint heat source had been running up there the entire time. By the third month, the noises were no longer limited to the nighttime. Linda, who worked from home, sometimes heard 3 very soft knocks coming from above her home office in the middle of the day. They always came one after another, separated by perfectly even pauses, as though someone were testing whether anyone downstairs could hear them. When she finally told Mark, he decided it was time to call in a professional to inspect the attic thoroughly for animals or hidden structural problems. The technician examined the space far more carefully than Mark had. Behind a large stack of old boxes, he noticed part of the attic had been deliberately rearranged to conceal a small hidden space. It measured no more than a single square meter, but it was just large enough for a thin person to lie down inside. Inside the space, he found nothing particularly alarming at first glance. A neatly folded gray blanket, an empty plastic water bottle, and a small rusty metal tube. Assuming they had simply been left behind by one of the previous homeowners years earlier, he paid little attention to them. After confirming there were no animals or structural issues, he finished his inspection and left. What no one noticed, however, was that the blanket wasn't covered in dust like everything else around it. It looked as though it had been used very recently. The very next week, things escalated dramatically. One night, Linda woke to a sound unlike anything she had heard before. This time, the footsteps were fast, almost frantic, as though someone were running across the attic toward a specific destination. before suddenly stopping. She woke Mark, and together they climbed upstairs carrying a flashlight to investigate. They found nothing but complete silence, an eerie stillness, as if everything had frozen the moment the footsteps on the staircase announced their arrival. That same night, Linda noticed something else. The small attic window, which had remained closed ever since they moved in, was now slightly open, only a few inches, but enough to let in the freezing autumn air. 2 days later, Tyler discovered something that truly frightened his parents for the first time. He was playing in his room when he noticed one of his favorite toys, a small plastic action figure he had lost weeks earlier, sitting neatly on top of his bookshelf, in plain sight. It was impossible to believe he could have overlooked it before. When he asked his mother if she had put it there, Linda immediately denied it, insisting she hadn't touched the toy since it disappeared. For the first time in months, both parents felt a genuine chill run through them. This was no longer just a mysterious noise that could be blamed on old wood or a wandering animal. Someone, whoever they were, had entered their son's bedroom while the entire family was asleep, and had handled his personal belongings. That night, Mark decided he wasn't waiting any longer. He installed a small security camera directly in front of the attic hatch, connecting it to an app on his phone that would send an instant alert whenever it detected movement. He told Linda he would stay awake in the nearby living room to keep watch himself. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, his phone suddenly vibrated. With slightly trembling hands, he opened the app. On the screen, he watched the attic hatch slowly open from the inside. Then a thin human figure emerged, moving with extreme caution as it climbed down the folding ladder, a ladder Mark had forgotten to secure properly that particular night. Mark rushed upstairs as quickly as he could without making too much noise. When he reached the hallway, he found a thin man dressed in filthy, worn-out clothes standing in the darkness just outside Tyler's bedroom door. The man froze for a single moment when he saw Mark. Then he bolted toward the back staircase and escaped through a door no one had realized had been broken from the inside for quite some time. Before Mark could catch him, or even get a clear look at his face, the stranger disappeared into the darkness surrounding the backyard. The family immediately called the police. When officers arrived and searched the attic much more thoroughly this time, they discovered that the hidden space behind the boxes wasn't just a random corner. It had been carefully prepared for someone to live there for extended periods. They found additional blankets hidden farther back, piles of empty food containers, and a small notebook with torn edges filled with fragmented notes that were difficult to interpret. Among them, however, were repeated entries documenting intimate details of the family's daily routine, when they went to bed, when they left the house, and even names written in a way that suggested they had been overheard from inside the home itself. To this day, no one knows who that man really was, or how long he had been secretly entering the attic without the family's knowledge. Some of the evidence discovered later suggested he may have been living there since the family's very first weeks in the house, taking advantage of his familiarity with a property that had sat abandoned for so long before it was sold. The case has never been officially closed, and no one matching the description Mark gave investigators that night has ever been arrested. The family moved into another home just a few weeks after the incident, leaving the old house overlooking the quiet neighborhood behind forever. But even today, in every new house she has lived in since then, Linda still pauses for a moment before going to bed, listening carefully to the silence above her head, wondering whether that silence is truly real, or merely waiting for the next footstep that hasn't been heard yet. In the spring of 2018, a man named Robert purchased an old country house in rural Pennsylvania. Originally built in the early 20th century, the house had stood vacant for more than 15 years before Robert bought it at an attractive price, hoping to restore it and turn it into a permanent family home. Having recently gone through a divorce, he was living alone and saw the project as an opportunity for a fresh start, away from the noise of the city. He fell in love with the home's original hardwood floors, its old stone fireplace, and the large neglected yard that seemed to be waiting for someone to bring it back to life. During his first week in the house, while carefully inspecting every room, Robert noticed a heavy metal door at the end of the hallway leading to the kitchen. It looked completely out of place among the rest of the home's wooden doors. The door had once been painted dark gray, though most of the paint had peeled away over the years. It was secured with a large antique padlock of a type rarely seen anymore, along with a thick metal chain wrapped around the handle and fastened with a second, smaller lock. None of the keys the real estate agent had given him fit either lock, and nowhere in the sale documents was there any explanation for why the door had been sealed so excessively. Curious, Robert asked several longtime neighbors about the history of the property. One elderly man, who had lived across the street for decades, told him that the family who had owned the house 15 years earlier had abandoned it without warning in the middle of the night. No one in the neighborhood had ever seen them again. According to him, the basement had been locked in that exact manner on the very night they left, by the family's own request before they disappeared. The old man admitted he didn't know any more than that, but he gave Robert one piece of sincere advice. Some things are better left sealed, exactly the way their owners left them. Robert wasn't convinced by the mysterious warning. He was a practical man who didn't believe in superstition, and he assumed it was nothing more than an old neighborhood story that had grown more dramatic with time. Even so, he postponed opening the door for several weeks, while focusing on restoring the rest of the house. Then summer arrived. Late at night, he began hearing a faint sound coming from behind the metal door. 3 slow knocks, then a long silence. A few minutes later, 3 more knocks. It sounded as though something on the other side was patiently waiting for an answer that never came. At first, Robert ignored it, convinced the noise came from old water pipes shifting under pressure, a common occurrence in abandoned houses. But the knocking continued almost every night, with unsettling consistency. Worse still, it gradually began to change. What had started as 3 perfectly even knocks evolved into irregular patterns, as though something was experimenting with different rhythms, as if it were learning or remembering something it had forgotten long ago. After 3 weeks of sleepless nights, Robert finally decided to end the mystery himself. He hired a local blacksmith to break the 2 old locks. On a Friday evening, armed with a powerful flashlight, he pulled open the heavy metal door that hadn't been opened in 15 years. A wave of cold, stale air drifted out to meet him. Beyond it was a narrow wooden staircase descending into darkness. He made his way down carefully, one step at a time, the old boards creaking beneath his feet as the sound echoed through the silent space. The basement was much smaller than he had imagined, no larger than an average bedroom, but it wasn't empty. In the far corner stood several old wooden crates stacked on top of one another. Beside them sat a single wooden chair positioned precisely in the center of the room, as though someone had spent a very long time sitting there before suddenly leaving. On the stone wall directly behind the chair, Robert noticed rows of deep scratches carved into the rock. They were arranged in neat lines, as if someone had been counting something day after day for an incredibly long time, then had abruptly stopped at one specific number, for no apparent reason. Robert approached one of the wooden crates and carefully lifted the lid. Inside were neatly folded children's clothes, faded family photographs of people he didn't recognize, and a small leather journal with worn, frayed edges. When he opened it, the first pages were filled with clear, tidy handwriting, describing ordinary daily life inside the house. But as he turned the pages, the writing gradually became more chaotic and disjointed. By the final pages, there were no recognizable words at all, only tangled, repetitive lines, and one single sentence, written in darker, heavier handwriting than everything else, repeated 3 times across the bottom of the final page. "It's still knocking. It's still knocking. It's still knocking." At that exact moment, Robert heard the same 3 knocks behind him. This time they came from the stone wall beside the chair, not from somewhere above, not through the door, but from directly behind the wall itself. They were far closer than they had ever sounded during the weeks he had spent upstairs. The journal slipped from his hands. Without looking back, Robert sprinted up the wooden staircase as fast as he could, slammed the heavy metal door shut behind him, and leaned against it, breathing hard. The locks were gone now. There was no way to secure the door the way it had once been. From that night on, Robert never entered the basement again. Instead, he reinforced the door from the outside with thick wooden planks nailed firmly into place. To this day, he has never discovered who the family before him really was, what the repeated sentence in the journal truly meant, or why the tally marks carved into the stone wall ended so suddenly at that exact point. And even now, on only the quietest of nights, he still hears faint knocking rising from beneath the floor, as though something down there, after all these years, is still waiting for someone to open the door once again. In the fall of 2019, a man named Ethan moved into a third-floor apartment in a relatively old apartment building in Chicago, after finally landing a better job that allowed him to leave behind a small apartment he had shared with a roommate for years. The new place seemed perfect for him. Affordable rent, a location close to work, and an unusual level of quiet for a neighborhood that was typically filled with noise. While Ethan was signing the lease, the real estate agent casually mentioned that the apartment directly above his, on the fourth floor, had been vacant for more than 3 years. He offered no detailed explanation, simply saying that the owner preferred to keep it empty because of complicated legal issues, something Ethan had no interest in asking about at the time. During his first 2 weeks there, Ethan noticed nothing unusual. He was completely occupied with arranging his furniture and settling into his new job. But on the 13th night, he woke up at around 1 o'clock in the morning to the unmistakable sound of footsteps directly above his head. They were slow, fairly heavy footsteps, moving from what seemed to be the bedroom toward the kitchen, pausing for a moment, then retracing the same path. At first, he assumed the real estate agent had simply been mistaken, and that someone must have rented the upstairs apartment without anyone telling him. He didn't think much of it and went back to sleep. The following morning, while chatting with one of his neighbors in the hallway, an elderly man who had lived in the building for many years, Ethan mentioned the footsteps. The neighbor assured him that the apartment upstairs was still completely vacant, just as it had been for the past 3 years. Curious, Ethan asked why such a well-located apartment had remained empty for so long. The old man's expression changed, ever so slightly. He simply said that the last tenant had left very suddenly, and that the landlord had struggled to find anyone willing to rent the apartment ever since. Without offering any further explanation, he quickly ended the conversation, as though he had no desire to discuss the subject any longer. The footsteps didn't stop after that first night. Instead, they became almost nightly. Every evening, between 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning, Ethan heard the same slow pacing overhead. At first, he convinced himself the sounds might actually be coming from another nearby apartment and traveling through the walls because of the building's old construction. Buildings of that age often carried sounds in misleading ways. But as the weeks passed, the noises became increasingly detailed. He began hearing the scrape of a chair across a hardwood floor, a faucet turning on for only a few seconds before shutting off again. Then one night, the sound of something small and metallic falling onto the floor. After that, complete silence for the rest of the night. One evening, Ethan finally decided to investigate for himself. He climbed to the 4th floor and stood outside the apartment directly above his. The door's lock was extremely old, covered with a thin layer of accumulated dust. Beside it was a small official notice, stating that the apartment was unoccupied and that entry was prohibited without authorization from building management. He knocked several times. No answer. He carefully pressed his ear against the door for a few seconds. Nothing. Only absolute silence. The apartment seemed just as empty as everyone claimed. He returned to his own apartment more confused than ever. But what happened that night unsettled him even more. The footsteps returned. Only this time they sounded louder than ever. Almost as though whoever was walking upstairs knew Ethan had been standing outside the door only a few hours earlier. For the first time since moving in, he heard something new. 3 soft knocks. Not on a door, on the floor itself. 3 slow taps, followed by silence. Exactly 1 minute later, the same 3 taps came again. This time, Ethan couldn't ignore what he was hearing. Determined to learn more, he searched online using the building's address and the apartment number. After digging through old records, he found a short article in the archive of a local newspaper, dating back more than 3 years. The article briefly reported that the tenant of that very apartment had vanished without a trace. The police eventually closed the investigation without reaching any clear conclusion, officially classifying the case as an unexplained disappearance. The article revealed no further details about the missing man's identity or the circumstances surrounding his disappearance. However, it did mention one small detail. According to his family, the last time anyone had spoken with him was late at night, at around 1 o'clock in the morning. After reading the article, Ethan found it almost impossible to sleep. He even avoided looking at the ceiling before going to bed. Then one night, while lying in bed trying to drift off, the familiar footsteps suddenly stopped directly above the center of his room, right above his bed. A moment later, he heard a slow, deliberate sound, as though someone were carefully lowering themselves onto the wooden floor. Then came a long, heavy, unbroken silence. It felt as though whoever or whatever was upstairs had sat down, or perhaps even lain down, remaining perfectly still, listening to the sounds below, just as Ethan had spent weeks listening to the sounds above. The following morning, Ethan went straight to the building management office and demanded a clear explanation. The manager simply repeated what everyone else had already told him. The apartment was officially vacant. No one had permission to enter it. The noises were probably nothing more than echoes traveling through the building's shared ventilation system. Ethan didn't believe a word of it, but he had no other way to prove what he had experienced. Less than 2 months after moving in, he packed his belongings and left the apartment behind. Yet one question has stayed with him ever since. Who was walking through that empty apartment every single night? And was the person who had disappeared there years earlier somehow still waiting for someone to hear them once again?